The key to a profitable betting strategy is to place value bets. You aren't going to win every bet, of course, but if you consistently place bets at odds higher than what the true odds are, you are going to be profitable in the long term. But as you probably already know, finding value bets can be a very difficult process. In this video, instead of generically talking about finding value bets, I'm going to break down a specific example of finding a value bet using a 3-step strategy. I've been using this 3-step strategy for the past few months now, and although some days the variance is bad, some days the results are much better, and overall I've been able to make this strategy profitable in the long run. In an ideal world, you can use betting models to predict what the odds of a game should be and compare the model's odds to the actual odds to see if there is discrepancy. But this isn't an ideal world. And don't get me wrong, models are useful, but the problem is there's too many variables and too much uncertainty for you to rely on them. Plus, unless you have genuine expertise in modelling and statistics, whatever model you're trying to use is probably already priced into the market by people who are more informed than you. Therefore, my emphasis when I'm trying to find value in the markets is moving further and further away from trying to accurately calculate in a model type situation what the odds should be, and moving more towards a critical thinking approach using my football experience and my market experience to try and identify mispricings. The principle of this strategy is to identify mispricings by comparing the odds of a game to what the efficient odds should be for this type of game, and then determine what the real odds should be and what your potential edge is from the bet. The game I'm using in this video as an example for this strategy is a Champions League game between Frankfurt and Napoli. By the end of this video, I will have walked you through step by step how I came to the conclusion that backing Napoli at odds of 2.26 was, in my opinion, a value bet. Step 1 of this strategy is an initial assessment of the odds and then finding reference games. And I'll explain what reference games are in a little moment. In general, at the start of the process, when I'm looking for value bets, I just dive straight onto Betfair and browse the odds of upcoming games. I've seen the odds of thousands of games in my betting career, so I've developed a good intuition for when the odds in a game look a little bit off. And you can do this too. It doesn't take that many markets for you to start seeing suspicious looking odds when scrolling through the day's games. This isn't to say that anytime you believe that you've seen a mispricing in the market, that you simply just jump in there and place a back bet, because that would be a very foolish thing to do. Instead, I would investigate the situation further, and if after analysing the situation it still looks like the value bet is there, then you would go in and place the bet in the market. On first reaction to seeing the odds in the Frankfurt and Napoli game, I was instinctively drawn to Napoli's odds to win the game at 2.26 and thought, yes, those odds look far too big to me. So why did I think Napoli were value to back? What is it that I'm looking for to identify these potential mispricings? Essentially, I'm using the odds from previous Premier League games, a league in which I'm very familiar with, to find what I call reference games. A reference game is a past game which I believe had fairly accurate or efficient odds. I compare reference games with games I want to bet on in different leagues and competitions around the world. This all may sound a little bit strange to you, so let me explain. In football, there's only a limited number of variations of types of games that can happen. For example, a league leader may face a team fighting relegation, 2 informed top half teams could face off, or maybe it's a relegation scrap. When you look into it, there's actually quite a few variations of football matches that are possible, of course, but the number is limited. And once you start to see many football matches, you start to become familiar with the odds and you start to see repeatable patterns in the odds, and you become accustomed to what the odds should be for specific types of football matches. To find reference games, you want to search in the league that you have the most knowledge in. For me, that is the Premier League. In the Premier League, I've seen every type of game possible countless times, so I'm fairly comfortable using the Premier League as a reference for other leagues and competitions around the world, particularly those that I'm not as familiar with. Yes, I know a fair bit about Napoli and I know a little bit about Frankfurt, but I'm definitely not an expert, so I can use the Premier League as a reference to then assess the Frankfurt and Napoli game. So how is it that I can do that? Napoli were priced between odds of 2.2 and 2.3. Clearly it is a different competition, but immediately I'm thinking that if this game was theoretically in the Premier League, what would these odds be telling me about the expected difference in quality between the two teams, and what type of games would we be expecting to see? To find the reference games that we're going to use on our target game, I check an odds compiling website like Odds Portal to view the odds of previous games. I'm looking to find a favourite playing away from home who has odds to win between 2.2 and 2.3 to match the situation in the Napoli game. We see it here, for example, when Man City played Arsenal. We also see it in games like West Ham versus Chelsea and Crystal Palace versus Spurs. Through using my Premier League knowledge regarding the quality of these teams at the time that these games were played, I can reasonably assess that odds of 2.2 or 2.3 typically present themselves in extremely close games when the favourite is only narrowly expected to win. Arsenal versus Man City was first versus second, and it was two tactically elite teams facing off. West Ham and Chelsea and Palace versus Spurs are examples of games of a decent team on paper facing a weaker team. But in reality, it's actually a very inconsistent team, struggling for form, going to a very difficult place to play up against a technically lesser side, but with an incredibly high motivation to pick up points. In this step of finding the reference games, I'm looking for as many games as possible because I'm trying to find accurate odds. And if I just find one game, there's no way of saying that this game actually had inefficient odds, which would make it useless as a reference game to compare to the game that I want to bet on. But if you find numerous games in the relevant odds range, then what are the chances that all of these games had inefficient odds? It's very low. Looking at the reference games that we have gathered, we can now begin to build a picture to see if it was justifiable for Napoli to be at the odds that they were for this game. From my initial analysis using the reference games, I'm defining an away favourite, odds of between 2.2 and 2.3, as a technically a better team than the opposition, but with a serious doubt on their chances of winning the game. And I want to either disprove or prove that Napoli fit this definition. If when I analyse this game, I see that Napoli were a decent team but were rather inconsistent in form, or alternatively, both Napoli and Frankfurt were very much in form, then I would say that this definition was fairly accurate at describing Napoli, and therefore the odds, we could say, are fairly accurate and there wouldn't be a value bet here. On the other hand though, if this game looked very different to what we're seeing in the reference games, then there's a potential that there's a value bet opportunity in this game. As we have identified a game and found our reference games to help us, we have now concluded step one of the value betting strategy, and we're now ready to move on to step two, which is the game analysis. So what is game analysis? Game analysis is analysing the two teams that are playing, and the critically important step here is that we're analysing this game to see how well it compares to the reference games that we found during step one of the strategy. So let's first examine Frankfurt. Frankfurt are a team doing quite well in the Bundesliga. They're currently sat in 6th position. Generally, their overall league form is a little bit up and down as they have 3 wins in their last 7 games, 43% win ratio. And when I first started to look at this, I was getting really excited because I sort of know how good Napoli are, and seeing this up and down form was making it even more likely that backing Napoli was a value bet. However, upon further inspection, there was a problem. I could see that Frankfurt's home form was really quite strong, with 4 wins in the last 4 games, which is probably the reason why the odds are priced the way that they are. Thinking back to our Premier League reference games that we obtained earlier, after an initial viewing of Frankfurt's form, I was thinking that this game was more looking like the Man City versus Arsenal example for the type of game, that being 2 very evenly matched teams with a slight edge to the away team, rather than the other types of games that we're seeing, the Chelsea and the Spurs games, which were decent teams against a lesser team, but the decent team was sort of out of form It seemed to be more like the Arsenal-Man City game, two informed teams but with the edge to the away team. So now I have a better understanding of what the reference game is. I'm thinking that if when I analyse Napoli, it turns out that Napoli just appear a little bit better than Frankfurt, in the same way that in my opinion Man City are a little bit better than Arsenal, we could say that the definition we created in step 1 of this strategy would fit this reference game. Then it would be fair to say that the odds here would be accurate and there wouldn't be a value position. But having watched Napoli a few times this season, I had a strong inclination that this wouldn't be the case. So let's take a look at Napoli. They are not just top of the Serie A, they are absolutely demolishing the league. Their staggering record of 18 victories in their last 19 games is something only the very elite teams in world football ever achieve. And it's no surprise why current projections have them as joint third favourites to win the Champions League this season. They are one of the best teams in the world this season, with two of the most dangerous and best players in the world at the moment. With Napoli looking as strong as they do, I was thinking that there must be something special about the recent victories that Frankfurt had been picking up for Napoli to not be shorter in odds of 2.26. So I decided to take a closer look at Frankfurt's form, and I noticed something very interesting. When looking deeper at Frankfurt's strong home form, it was actually much weaker than it had initially looked. In this recent 4-game winning streak, all 4 of the teams were actually below Frankfurt in the league, and 3 of the 4, Schalke, Hertha and Hoffenheim, actually made up the bottom 4 teams of the Bundesliga. So these are all teams you would expect Frankfurt to beat. Even when we take a more general look at the home form across the season, we see that Frankfurt typically struggle against teams above or around them in the league. They lost to Wolfsburg, who are of similar quality, but also lost to high quality teams like Bayern Munich and Borussia Dortmund. Thinking back to our Premier League reference games, my opinion was getting stronger and stronger that this game that we're planning on putting a bet on was quite a bit different to the reference games that we had found. The expected difference in quality between Napoli and Frankfurt based on the odds compared to the actual difference in quality between the two teams which we have found during our analysis is staggering. In my opinion, Arsenal versus Man City was a much closer matchup than Frankfurt versus Napoli. We are close to moving on to step 3 of the strategy, which is finding new reference games which are more comparable to the actual game that we're looking at, rather than just looking for reference games based off the odds, which we can then use to calculate what the expected value of the value bet is. Before we look at that though, I did want to check the European form of both of these teams this season, because we are comparing two teams from different leagues here, and it is possible that one of these leagues could be much stronger than the other one. So although Frankfurt are 6th in the Bundesliga, if we was to assume that the Bundesliga was a much more difficult league than Serie A, being 6th in the Bundesliga might actually be a much better accomplishment than it initially seems. So this possibility is something that I wanted to eliminate, and I did this by comparing the European form. In the Champions League group stages, Frankfurt had a mixed bag. They definitely looked like a lower quality team than Tottenham though, and at this moment Tottenham are a much worse team than Napoli, in my opinion. This is another positive sign for the value bet. Napoli had a much stronger group campaign than Frankfurt did, impressively winning 5 of their 6 games, scoring 3 or more goals in each of these victories too. Their only defeat was at Anfield, which is one of the most difficult grounds to go to, and it was a dead rubber as Napoli had already won the group. After performing step 2 of this strategy, the game analysis, there is 2 possible conclusions that you can have. Either the game you intend to bet on is consistent with the reference games you identified in step 1. In that case, we are assuming that the odds are fairly efficient and fairly accurate, and that there is no value bet opportunity here, and it's a simple case of forgetting about this game and moving on to different opportunities. The other conclusion you can have following the game analysis is that the 2 teams that you're intending to bet on in that game, the difference in quality between those 2 teams is significantly different than that of the 2 teams in the reference game of similar odds. And in this instance, there's a very strong case that a value bet is on the cards. Given all of the evidence that I'd found during the game analysis, the verdict, in my opinion, was pretty conclusive Napoli were far more likely to win this game than the market was suggesting they was. And once we've come to that conclusion, it's now time to move on to step 3 of the strategy, and that is trying to identify what the actual odds should be. So let's think about the process that we've followed so far. We've collected data and essentially calibrated our thinking to what a game should look like when the odds are the way that they are. We've then found a game which is a massive outlier from our calibration. So now we are here in the final step where we need to recalibrate our thinking to determine what we think the true odds are. We do this by finding a new set of reference games. For the Frankfurt and Napoli game I'm using in this video, I went back to check historic Premier League odds on OddsPortal to find new reference games which matched what I believe to be the difference in quality between Frankfurt and Napoli. This is why it's very important that the league you're using to find your reference games is the league that you are most familiar with, because it's the league where you know all of the qualities and weaknesses of each of the teams. I can then use the odds of the away team in the reference games to determine what the odds should be for Napoli in this game against Frankfurt. My criteria when looking for these new reference games was to try and initially find a team that emulated Napoli's quality. In the Premier League, there's only really Arsenal and Man City that we're talking about here that matched the relative quality of Napoli. My job is to find games that either Arsenal or Man City have played when they played an opposition which is, relatively speaking, similar quality to Frankfurt. So a team I'm looking for is a team that's in and around trying to compete for the European places. Ideally, I'd want them to be on a strong run of home form, but also to be not the best when playing teams that are better than them or of equal quality to them in the league. I'm essentially trying to find the teams that emulate Frankfurt's qualities that we found in the game analysis section, because overall I want to emulate a Frankfurt versus Napoli game as best as I possibly can from all of the Premier League games that have ever happened. The most recent game I found, which was reasonably close to what I was looking for, was Man United versus Man City. To be honest, United looked comparatively a little bit too strong compared to Frankfurt, but they were a team competing for the European places, and like Frankfurt, had been on a 4-game winning streak. United did, however, have a good record against similar or better quality teams in the league, which was unfortunate because this is the opposite to what Frankfurt had, who struggled against similar or better quality teams. On top of that, Man City had comparatively weaker form going into this game than Napoli have going into their game against Frankfurt. If anything, I would say using this game as a reference point would show larger than expected odds for the away team than what we should expect for Napoli in their game against Frankfurt, because Man United appeared to have a greater chance of beating Man City than Frankfurt had of beating Napoli. Despite that, when we check the odds for the Man United and Man City game, we see that Man City started the game at odds of 1.91, a significant difference when compared to odds of 2.26 that Napoli are to win at Frankfurt. And as I just mentioned, if anything, Napoli are more likely to win than City were, so odds of 1.91 made themselves in fact be too big. Looking at one game alone, we can't possibly know if the odds in this game were efficient, which is why we need to find more reference games to pinpoint what the average odds should be for this type of game. After digging around and finding as many similar games to the target game as possible, I found this series of games and I started to see a trend with the odds. A trend which was that in a game like Frankfurt versus Napoli, a team like Napoli should probably be priced odds of about 1.9 to 1.95, or quite possibly even lower. As we have found multiple games, we could be in a position to say maybe not all of the odds from these games were efficient. This Chelsea-Man City game, for example, the odds were much shorter than the other games I found. Either I'm wrong in my thinking to assume these games are similar, or this game itself was mispriced and City will lay value for this game. Without investigating further, it's difficult to say which way it is, but this is why it's so important to assess many games to piece together what the average odds are, so you don't get tricked by a game like this, and think that there is even more value on offer than there actually is for this value bet. After I'd followed the 3-step value betting strategy, which I've outlined throughout this video, of number 1, identifying a game and then finding the reference games for that particular game. Number 2, analysing the game and comparing it to the reference games to see if there was any mispricings. And number 3, looking for new reference games to then assess what the true odds for the game should be. I was finally in a position where I was pretty much confirmed that backing Napoli at 2.26 was in fact a value bet, as the odds were probably should have been closer to about 1.95 and not all the way up at odds of 2.26. Now we've identified what the true odds should be, we have to decide whether it's worth placing the bet or not. If after getting this far we find the bet is only slightly positive in expected value, it might not be worth placing the bet after all. So let's calculate what the expected value is for this bet. If my assumptions were correct, it would mean that my £100 bet on Napoli to win, to return £126 worth of profit, would have an expected value of around £16. At this point, I don't really mind if Napoli go on to win this game or not. If my analysis was correct and this was a value bet, yes, I might win or lose this bet here, but in the long term, I will be profitable. Which is what my results have been showing since I've been taking this strategy more seriously. And because I have been on OddsPortal so frequently, researching the previous odds, looking for reference games, I've memorised the efficient odds for many different types of games. Which means I can identify what I believe to be value bets much quicker when I'm browsing through Betfair on a daily basis. I can get the bets placed, and because this isn't a trading strategy, I can leave these bets open and check my results at the end of the day, with the aim of being profitable, not over a day, not over a week, maybe not even over a month, but in the long run, ideally I want to be profitable. If you're curious to know how I calculated the expected value of this bet to be about £16, make sure to click the end screen of this video and you can find out how I did that, and that's coming up right after I thanked all these people who are supporting me on Patreon. I very much appreciate it. If you like to support me and get exclusive benefits such as trading videos, useful calculators and much more, you can learn more about it in the description below. And although I was a bit critical about models earlier in the video, you can download the models that I've made. And of course it's just a model, and like all models, they aren't perfect, but they can be used during the game analysis step of this strategy to better identify when your target game fits or doesn't fit the reference games that you've identified. And as promised, here is the video I was referring to about calculating the expected value of a position. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention that in the end, Napoli did end up winning. So that was a nice £126 profit.